I'm Dennis Hunt, the Adult Education Director at Bear Creek Bible Church in Keller, Texas. Hey, thanks for joining my third lesson in our Calibrate video series, The Bible at 40,000 Feet. In these lessons, we look at the Bible from a big picture perspective. And if you're like me, sometimes you read a Bible story and just can't figure out what it means or why it's even in the Bible. When that happens, take a moment to step back and consider God's broader plan and the themes that run through the Bible. Now that usually helps me to gain a clearer understanding and perspective of how an individual story fits in the greater story. Providing that big picture view is what I want to do in this series. In the first lesson, I explained how we got into this mess, a troubled world where Satan took the form of an animal and now rules over people who make up gods in their own image. In the last lesson, I explained how the Bible documents the true history of the world using a hero narrative story with God as the hero. It starts with a wonderful creation that was subjugated by Satan and sin, but that God will restore through his Son, the Messiah. The genealogy of the Messiah becomes the central thread through the entire story, and this lesson will focus on that. In the last two lessons, I'll develop a biblical timeline of history that will pull the whole big picture together, give hope, and bolster your faith in times of trouble. Now, I know genealogies are boring, and many people have given up reading through the Bible when they get to the genealogy sections, but stick with me. Even Paul warned Timothy not to get bogged down with myths and endless genealogies. Paul says instead to focus on the administration of God, which is by faith. Faith in what? In Jesus the Messiah, of course, and that's what I want to do. Focus on the Messiah, the central thread throughout the Bible. There are a lot of themes that run through the Bible, like discovering God's attributes, things like sacrificial mercy, his holiness, sovereignty, omnipotence, etc., or the nation of Israel and the Promised Land, and even food, the effects of sin and redemption, the idea of justice, law, and sacrifice. One of my favorites is living a life of faith, hope, and love. But all these reflect the coming kingdom, and most importantly, all of them point to the central theme, the Messiah. It is the coming of the Messiah in the Old Testament that brings with it intrigue and rivalry, jealousy and fear, loyalty and redemption, and God's intervention. When you remember that the key to understanding the Bible comes from focusing on the Messiah, it will help you understand some passages that are difficult to take at face value. Before I jump into some really cool Old Testament stories about the genealogy of the Messiah, let's look real quick at the New Testament and why this central theme is important. The first verse of the New Testament starts with the record of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah. Now, I don't think this is a coincidence. It is because Jesus' genealogy is the critical link between the Old Testament and the New. As the recorded genealogy begins to scroll, Matthew highlights a couple key people, Tamar and Ruth. We'll look at them later. Matthew begins with Abraham, moves on to King David. He then links Jesus through the kings of Judah, through the exile, and ends with Joseph, the husband of Mary, by whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. This genealogy is commonly attributed as the legal line of Joseph, even though Joseph is not credited as the paternal father. Luke also has a genealogy. It's different from Matthew's between David and Joseph, and scholars don't agree on why. Some say it's Mary's genealogy, others a natural genealogy of Joseph or his uncle. We may never know, and discussing it is not important to this lesson. What is important is that Luke also links Jesus to King David. This is an important Old Testament prophecy about the Messiah. The prophet Nathan received a message from God to tell King David that God would establish a kingdom from one of David's descendants and would establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Although part of this prophecy was fulfilled in Solomon, it wasn't completely fulfilled. In Acts chapter 2, Peter's Pentecost sermon references this prophecy as he makes the case for Jesus as the rightful Messiah and a descendant of David. Even Jesus references this when he responded to the Jews who were looking for a sign. Jesus said, Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. They thought he was talking about Herod's temple, but Jesus was talking about his resurrection and ultimately establishing his house and the throne of his kingdom forever. There's another interesting thing in Luke's genealogy. It goes all the way back to Adam and God. Matthew was writing to the Jewish people and started with Abraham, but Luke was writing to Gentiles and therefore goes back to Genesis and the beginning of all humanity. There are two key takeaways from these New Testament genealogies. First, the genealogy of the Messiah is important. And second, like Luke, we'll have to go back to Genesis and investigate how the genealogy of the Messiah weaves its way through the biblical story. Genesis is a book that spans about 2,400 years of history. To cover that much time, it is actually organized by genealogies. 10 times the common phrase, the generations of, is used to introduce a new section. Interspersed in the genealogies are great stories about people, their successes, failures, faith, struggles, and most importantly, God's intervention to ensure the genealogy of the Messiah survives. I'm going to highlight a couple of those that demonstrate this. I hope you remember in Genesis 3 when God declares his punishment for sin and gave us a first glimpse into his plan to send a new Adam to fix our sin problem. Well, he also banished Adam and Eve from the garden and cursed the ground to make it toilsome to work. If you turn to Genesis 5, you'll find the genealogy from Adam to Noah. If you thought this was boring and skipped it, you would have missed a key point. In verse 29, Lamech, Noah's father, declared that he thought Noah would be the one who would lift the curse on the ground. In a sense, Noah was a savior, but saved only his own family from the flood. Through Noah's son Shem came Terah, who was the father of Abraham. The rest of Genesis, from chapter 12 to the end, follows Abraham's descendants. The first prophecy that the Messiah would come from Abraham is in chapter 12. Abraham was told to go to a land God will show him, and God will make him a great nation. Not only will the nation of Israel come from Abraham, but all the families of the earth will be blessed by the offspring that is in you. Throughout the rest of Genesis, there are at least 10 more statements by God that pass the line of the Messiah from Abraham to Isaac, then Jacob, who was renamed Israel, and then through Israel's son, Judah. Now Judah had a son named who married Tamar. This story in Genesis chapter 38 is one that many people don't understand. When I first read it, I thought it had no redeeming value, and it didn't even seem to fit in the flow of the story. If you've never read the story of Judah and Tamar, you might pause this video now and read it. It is a terrible story that starts with marrying Tamar. Was the firstborn of Judah, and therefore in line for the inheritance. But because he was evil, God killed him before he could have a child. Onan, Er's brother, was supposed to allow Tamar to have offspring, but Onan spilled his seed, and God killed him for that. Can it get worse? Well, yes. Tamar then disguises herself as a prostitute and gets her father-in-law, Judah, to have sex with her. She gets pregnant, and when Judah finds out, he wants to burn her for her indiscretion. But wait, Tamar reveals to the unsuspecting Judah that the child is his, and in a surprise move, Judah declares her righteous. What? How can Tamar be more righteous? And what gives Judah the right to declare it? Well, if I didn't know how this story fits in the bigger story, I could make a great cult out of these precepts. But I do know the story. The story is about the line of the Messiah. You see, Tamar gave birth to Perez. And if you remember from Matthew's genealogy, Tamar was specifically highlighted in the line of Jesus, the Messiah. What the story really tells us is that faith in the Messiah is the key, even in the Old Testament. Was evil, and Onan didn't care about the Messiah. They were killed. Judah knew he was in line for the Messiah, but didn't willingly fulfill his responsibility. Tamar, on the other hand, ensured the line of the Messiah would carry on. She was declared righteous, not for her actions, but for protecting the line of the Messiah. It is the same in the New Testament. We're not declared righteous by our actions, but by placing our faith in Jesus, the Messiah. The rest of Genesis, through the exodus of Moses and Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land, follows a supporting storyline, the need for God's intervention to establish the nation of Israel, through which the Messiah would come. The Bible then moves into the time of the Judges. We read about that in the books of Judges, Ruth, and 1 Samuel. Judges follows the supporting storyline about God's intervention to ensure Israel remains capable of producing the Messiah. It is a sad time, as the recurring theme is that without a leader, the people did evil in the sight of God. It was a vicious cycle of depravity, oppression, God's intervention, redemption, and back to depravity. Without God, Israel surely would have vanished. But then, in stark contrast, is the book of Ruth. Most of you are familiar with this short book. It is a wonderful story of loyalty and redemption, of faith, hope, and love. Or is it? You might love the story, but have never asked why the story was put in the Bible. It's not just a good story about good values. It is the critical link that connects the genealogy of the Messiah that ends in Genesis with Perez to King David. The end of Ruth summarizes its purpose. Ruth and Boaz bore a son for Naomi named Obed, so that the line of the Messiah would not be broken. Remember Matthew's genealogy? It specifically identified Ruth for this purpose. In this lesson, I've tried to highlight how important it is to understand the overarching story of the Bible in order to understand why certain short stories are included. Sadly, I only had time to illustrate a few examples. But now I hope you realize that even though there are many supporting themes, the central theme is the Messiah. Realizing this will strengthen your Bible studies and bolster your faith. You see, faith in the Messiah is the message of both the Old Testament and the New. In the next lesson, I will start to build a timeline of history strictly using the Bible's revelation. You'll be amazed at what you can learn when you graphically see 2,400 years of history unfold. I hope you'll join me as we continue to view the Bible at 40,000 feet. God bless.